welcome to the Hennessy's house with me, your host, Nicole Hennessy. Today we are meeting with Wendy Ezzell, and she is going to talk to us all about sex. So she is a licensed clinical mental health counselor and has been for over 20 years. And we are going to really dive into the topic about sex education with children of all ages. So probably grab a pen and paper for this one, moms.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for being here with us today, Wendy.
I'm so excited to be here with you. You've got so many cool things to talk about.
Yeah, we really do. I'm excited for this conversation. I was telling a couple of my friends we were having this conversation today, and they're like, I can't wait for this episode because it's something a lot of us struggle on because of our own personal backgrounds and issues that it's an
Absolutely.
uncomfortable conversation, but such an important one to have, right?
It really is. And I hope that throughout our conversation, folks understand that we're not going to be perfect as parents. We're not going to be perfect as educators. And we really have to give ourselves grace and understand that we're doing the best that we can with what we have. And when you know better, you do better. So
Oh, that's like my motto is
that's
like we
it.
can all always do better. There's
That's it.
no shame in trying to learn and change and adjust. Yeah.
That's it. Exactly.
So why don't you tell us first just a little bit about you and the work you do and what led you to do it?
Sure. I actually started off as a special education teacher. And when I graduated, I finished out the last 2 months of the school year as a hired teacher and never went back. I was like, how many kids were coming to school with no food, little to no supervision, trauma in their history, their families having trauma in their history? I was like, I can't do this. The kids need better. So I went immediately back to school, got my clinical mental health counseling degree, a master's in arts for that, and have literally skipped to work every day since then. I love what I do. I'm passionate about reproductive health across the lifespan, family building, children's sexual health, families developmentally. So yeah, it's my passion.
I love that. And I feel like you're not the only one that I've talked to that was in some form an educator at some point and felt discouraged, so to speak, about, too much emphasis on test scores, not enough on mental health. And I feel like adult conversations, we have this a lot on the podcast, is about breaking family cycles, right?
Yes.
And like how to do better than the generations before us. And that could be anything. That could be like, going with a different career route. That could be the way we raise our children,
Absolutely.
sex education. And so I feel like it's interesting that you say that because it's like when you see it in the children, you see that next cycle of the bad habits and behaviors are happening, and you only have this like inch amount of wiggle room for helping them and supporting them in the industry. So, I mean, there's amazing teachers out there. So please, if you're an educator,
Yes.
like there are I
Matter.
couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Like I couldn't. And I went to school to be a special needs teacher, and I couldn't get myself to do the classroom. So, I think
Yeah.
it's an amazing job, and props to everyone who does it. It's
Yes.
too bad that the district wide level doesn't give more support to its teachers is the issue.
Yes. I have mad respect for all the teachers and the school social workers and the school counselors. Our kids couldn't, our communities couldn't survive without them, especially with COVID.
Especially, yeah. Oh my gosh, the way the teachers have had to adapt this last year, like I tell all the moms, like everybody needs to buy their kids' teachers like a wine box subscription or something. Like you guys, I just
Yeah,
couldn't, and a vacation somewhere,
exactly. Go big.
right?
Yeah.
So let's dive into kiddos. I want to talk about sex education, but I want to break it down with you by like age groups
Sure.
and just kind of like what's appropriate at what ages and the way we
Okay.
communicate with our kids.
So, my perspective comes from the experience I've had in child trauma and as a child forensic interview for a while, and as a trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapist for a child advocacy center for many years. So, that's the development that I come from. That's my perspective. So, early and often, even with typically developing children and special needs kids, so you can do a lot with both populations. And there's tons of resources out there, and I have a list that I can give you if you want to write it down or put it out there for folks.
Yeah, we
um,
can link it in the
sure.
description.
Sure, because kids, especially, at certain ages, they shut us out and don't want to hear it. It's blah, 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 blah. So we want to do early and often so we can build that foundation, but then the visuals, and they're into the social media. There's so many awesome resources out there for the middle schoolers and the high schoolers when we get to that developmental milestone. But birth to 4, you're going to have these conversations daily, actually starting on the changing table. So if you're wiping poop off of somebody's scrotum, and you're going to use those words. Okay, let's let daddy wipe that poop off your scrotum. You're going to name every single body part as it is. We don't call elbows anything other than elbows. So same thing with penis, vagina, scrotum, breast, and perpetrators will use fake names for those things in games. So we really want to make sure we give kids the proper vocabulary.
Do you think that there's common? I know that there's probably a lot, but when with the work you've done, is there specific terms that you've heard a lot that are like triggers for you? So like what if your kid comes home and says a term that you don't use in your house? Would that be a good warning for a parent of like, wait a minute, if you like you shouldn't be hearing a term like that?
I think I'm biased because my ears, I'm so hyper aware in child abuse and trauma that I'm probably one of those people that's gonna be like, oh, tell me about that. What was that? Where did you learn that? Who said that? How'd you know that? So that might be my bias though. But I encourage all parents. My favorite phrase is, oh, tell me more about that. Because you can get phenomenal information from little kids, middle schoolers, and high schoolers with that one phrase. So.
Yeah. Yeah. As long as you've created this foundation, right?
Absolutely. And that's what we're working towards, is educating folks to not be scared to use those terms and set that foundation. Absolutely.
So when do you feel like that conversation changes from like diaper changes and bath time, right? When you're giving
Mhm.
your child a bath, things like that, to starting to mention other things in sexual development. And this would include, I feel like, because what we're talking about here, not just sex education and like what are my body parts, but also that they are just for you. And this is your body, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kids love visuals, kids love books. So I always encourage, well, even my own children, and encourage the folks that I work with over the years to build your library. Have your library full of all of the books that talk about consent. There's tons of good little kid books that kids don't know that's what that is about consent. It's your bubble, protecting your privacy, protecting your space. So like you said, Nicole, it's starting in the bathtub, and then you just continue it on every day. You're driving in the car, singing the songs. I mean, they have Sirius Radio. You have songs on child protect. There's so many things you can do to where you're not having that one and done conversation or that lecture type conversation where you're doing all the talking and they're doing all the listening. It's very integrative at this point.
And what's funny is like you think about parenting, and
Mhm.
as a mom, how many times can we say, I've told you this 1,000 times? And that
Yeah.
could be anything like, don't walk through the house with your shoes on. Don't throw your coat on
That's
the
a big one
floor.
at my house right now.
Me too. It
You're
drives me
walking through the
nuts.
house with your shoes on. There's COVID on your feet.
I see that too. It's good to know I'm not the only one. I'm
Yep.
like walking around outside, people spitting on the sidewalk.
Yep.
Anyway, so it's funny. It's like we have to remind them of the little simple things like
Mhm.
over and over again. So to think that one good sit down conversation is sunk in and now it's
Yep.
all retained
Yep.
is such a silly, it can't be. But I think that
Exactly.
it's that way for so many. And
Yes.
I think hopefully this is changing generationally speaking. I think that like younger generations and like with small kids now, like this group of parents
Mhm.
that are entering into the world of parenting, our views are a little bit different, right? Than like some of the generations before us. But like for me, and my parents are awesome, they definitely threw a book at me. They were like, here's a book, have a
Yep.
nice day. And that would,
Yep.
I mean,
We've been
like I'm
done.
going to sit there and read
Like,
it on my own.
no.
No,
Yeah.
I didn't even read the books I was supposed to in school. Like, there's
Exactly.
no way.
And that circles back to what you said in the beginning, is that every generation does it better. And they do. I mean, the research supports that. Your parents did it better than their parents. You're doing it better than yours. And then your kids are going to do it better than you. And that's what we want. There's no
Right.
competition here. We want our kids to do it better than we did. We've not done this before.
Yeah.
So,
No. And it's, I
yeah.
mean, it's everybody learning together. And I feel like that's true for anything in life. Like, don't you, if you, if you're a good parent and you love your kids, like you want your kids to to do better than you.
That's
You
it.
want them to be
Students and
happier than
teachers
you.
together. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you feel like with kiddos of any it could, I mean, like, it doesn't have to be for all ages, but are at any particular age that sex education should look differently depending on gender?
Personally and professionally, I feel like we should be educating all of our kids transparently, honestly, openly, and especially if you have a non-binary or transgender kid. I mean,
Yeah.
there's ways that you're going to address that as well, and there are many resources out there, thankfully. But I think boys should understand all that girls go through. I think girls should understand all that boys go through. So I'm a big fan of
Hmm.
we need to educate them about everything because that builds empathy, that builds compassion,
Yeah.
that builds respect for what they're never going to have the perspective of.
Right.
So,
And
mhm,
that's easier done if you have children of both sex. Like
yes.
like I have two daughters and a son. So like sex education in our house is like, pretty clear.
Perfect.
Like Mark's
Hmm.
got a, little guy's got a penis, big girl's got a vagina. Like it's just,
That's
it's
it.
what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, like the little ones bathed together when they were little and stuff. It's like it's always been around that way. And so yes, it's more obviously
Yeah.
clear. But if you only have one child, I feel like maybe I don't know, but I would feel like maybe you're more inclined to not educate on the other gender, so to speak, whatever that looks like, including transgender, right? Like whatever gender you're not addressing. I
Right.
had one sister growing up, and
Mhm.
I don't think we had any like male sex education in our home.
Yeah, and that's not out of negligence. That's just, oh, I didn't think about that. That's why you're
Mhm.
doing your podcast, is
Yes.
so we can get that out there. Like,
Yeah.
oh wow, I didn't think about that. Let me add that to my long to-do list. So yeah.
Right? Yeah,
Hmm.
and I mean, this goes the same, like, if you're a single mom or a single dad and you
Yeah.
have the opposite gender for a child, like, that's an added layer to this as
Mhm.
well. I feel like I had a girlfriend when we were really young, right? Like, I maybe, like, in 20, right? And we were both moms, and she had a boy. She was a single mom, dad wasn't involved.
Mhm.
He went to preschool and was potty trained, and she called me crying because she said, "I feel like I failed my son." And I said, "Why?" And she goes, "Because the other kids were making fun of him because he only sits down to pee." And
Ah,
she never like she didn't teach him how to pee standing up. And I was like, "You did not, he pees on a toilet." Like, but it was one of these aha moments that stuck with me like 16 years later, right?
yes.
That sometimes we just naturally don't think about certain things, and it doesn't mean you're a bad parent by any means, but when it's not something you do with your
Do,
body,
exactly,
it's
because
different.
we have our own experiences, and ironic that you're saying that because a lot of, parents that I work with, have a lot of European parents here, and they teach their boys to sit when they pee, at least
Yeah.
in our little community here, and so it's interesting because folks are definitely breaking out of what we think is traditional norms, so
Yeah.
even
Well,
as potty training. Mhm.
right. And then like we're also in this time where like it's not like the majority of the population is necessarily circumcised anymore, right? Because there's like culturally speaking, that's different
Yep.
in different cultures, but also societally, the way this generation is, I think less and less are circumcising. Like some insurance companies won't even cover the procedure anymore,
Ah,
right? They look at it as cosmetic. So, yeah, so there's like even I think if you have a boy, especially like they're going to get to the age where they're in a boys' locker room and things like that. So educating on those types of things that like there's multiple ways this could look. There's multiple ways this.
exactly. That's why I'm big on the open and the transparent because not everybody's family is going to do what our family does or what your family does. So developing that empathy and that compassion and just that tolerance to diversity. I mean, not everybody does it the same way.
Right. So let's
Mhm,
go back to like kiddos in the bathtub. You're giving
mhm,
your kid a bath and
mhm,
they're like, I don't know, let's say let's say 5 years old, right? Because 5 is like a good age of like brain
mhm,
development and they can
mhm.
take on a little bit more as far as conversation versus like a 2-year-old.
Yep.
So you got a 5-year-old in a bathtub, you're giving him a bath, you're making sure you're saying the appropriate body parts. Now, how do we take that a step further to introduce like consent and how that your body is private and it's for you, and like what are good things that we could say as parents
Right.
to.
Some good scripts. And
Mhm.
there's one of my most favorite, and I try to stay up to date with them, is the Mama Bear Effect.org is the most comprehensive, beautiful, has scripts, everything we need as parents from birth to teens. And some of the scripts that they talk about are um, asking questions like, um, who's allowed to touch you? Who do you give high fives to and hugs to? So teaching them about their bubble, their space, not just their private, but building upon that to get to their private. So see, we're cleaning your penis or we're cleaning your vagina. Nobody's allowed to do that but me, because I'm helping you keep it clean and healthy and safe. And so our doctor is Dr. Archer. So is Dr. Archer allowed to touch you? Well, I don't know. Yes, no. Yep. Dr. Archer with mommy in the room is allowed to look at and touch that, because why? Because he's keeping you safe and healthy. And then we go into brainstorming ways. So and so is your brother, your sister, your uncle, your aunt. Nope, they're not allowed to. Nope, they're not allowed to. And explaining why not, age appropriately for a 5-year-old, of course. So,
Right, right. And I think a big part with kids, I feel like, is feeling that sense of like, I did something wrong if something were to happen, right? They have that like, I don't want to tell because I don't want to get in trouble, or I did something bad, or they told me I had to keep this a secret.
yep,
So, is there any specific verbiage along that of making sure our children know like these are not secrets we keep? Or is
right.
it just that simple? Like,
It can be just that simple, but I do want to say that 100% of all predator behavior belongs on the predator, not kids, because kids don't have the bandwidth, the experience, the brain development to be able to protect themselves from what an adult is going to do.
right.
So do we say you can say no, go and tell? Absolutely. Does that mean they're going to do it? Maybe not, because the majority of kids don't tell, even when they've had the best education and the best transparency. And it's just not our natural, it's not our natural state. I mean, a lot of people go through that fight, flight, freeze, or comply. With little kids, I mean, especially with 90% of all children are sexually abused by somebody that they know, love, and care about. So is stranger danger real? Absolutely. We've got all this social media, we've got TikTok, we've got it all that, people, it's a portal into our homes. That's a whole nother story. But yeah, 100% is the responsibility of the adult or the older person that's taking care of them. So
Yeah. So it's just making sure your kids feel like you're not overreactive. I say that a lot. Like when people ask me like how I've talked to my kids, I say to me one of the big things is making uncomfortable conversations not feel uncomfortable.
right. Even if
Because
you have to practice as a parent in the mirror, because it's
yeah,
hard. That's your
yeah.
baby. Mhm.
And also like I feel like if you yourself have encountered any kind of sexual abuse or have any serious uncomfortableness, or were raised in a culture that like you don't want to do that with your kids, but you were raised that you don't talk about these things, then it's even harder to make
It
it
is.
not feel uncomfortable.
It is. And I think we can validate, like you said, it's natural for it to be uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
so what can we do to just push on through that? Repetition early and often, have our little talks with ourselves in the mirror, get it, get all the nerves out. But really, if we're doing it early and often, you're going to be more and more and more comfortable, from the change in table to the elementary schooler to the middle schooler. Because really, by between 7 and 9, kids should know all about puberty and all about intercourse. So,
Yeah, and I bet you that's going to shock a lot of listeners because that
mm,
feels young, right? Like I mean my
it does.
middle one just turned 10 and I still kind of look at her as this like innocent little kiddo. Now for us sex education was different, right? Sex education had to be introduced very directly in our home because my teenage daughter is a mom,
Yep.
right? So there was so many questions and I was like it's time that we have a serious conversation. But I always thought it was more like 9 to 10. So interesting. 7 to 8. Is that what you're saying? 7 to 8.
I go by a typically developing child between 7 and 9 years old. So
Okay.
just in
So
the middle.
how do you have a conversation
Mhm.
around about intercourse with a
Mhm.
kid of that age?
That goes back to building that library. So, I mean, I have a book right here. I just got this one and I love it. So in your library, having a book, something about what makes a baby. So you're not just sitting down with a book. You've been reading this book for 2 or 3 years now. So, and it's awesome. It even has pictures in there about a C-section and a vaginal birth on 4 to 7 year old terms. So I have, this is, I thought this was beautiful. I work with a lot of reproductive endocrinologists, and he had a video on his Instagram of his little girl, and his son was standing next to her, the biggest smile on his face. It was just natural to them, of holding a uterus and the birth canal. And she was explaining, so here's where the baby comes out. And she was explaining it, and she was maybe 5 years old. And she had all the terminology, and she was just showing it. And she was just so proud. She was teaching everybody about this birth canal. So, I mean, there are Play-Doh, there's books. I mean, all the teachers out there, we can really get into some neat ways to teach. And the Mama Bear Effect has coloring sheets. They have videos. I mean, there's so many ways to get that information in there.
It's mamabear.org.
TheMamaBearEffect.org.
Okay. And I'll link that below, moms, so you can see that.
Okay.
I would love it if you could maybe also, after the podcast, send me a couple of your favorite book recommendations
I
that we
will.
could maybe link, because I think that would be great.
I will.
So, okay. So that explains, like, what the way you just explained that is more like about how somebody gives birth, and but like when you say the word intercourse, I think like we're talking about these kids about like the actual act of sex.
Mm-hmm. Like how the seed gets together. And for a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, that's going to be basic. You're just talking about seeds. You're talking about sperm and egg. They don't have
Right.
the developmental bandwidth to process the actual what intercourse is. But there is another book that's one of my favorites. It's Not the Stork, that talks about
Good
directly
title.
it's not the stork, that talks about the penis going in the vagina, and that's how the seeds match up. It's very basic.
So, how do you react because I mean, like, I'm imagining having this conversation with my 7-year-old son, right?
Mhm.
And I could see him being like, wait, what? And like totally freaked out and grossed
Yeah,
out by the concept of it.
you might be, and you're just going to normalize it. You're going to be,
Like,
and
yeah,
remember, this isn't one and done. This is just
yeah.
we're reading 3 books tonight, and one of them happens to be that one. We're reading 4 books on Saturday, and this one happens to be one of them. So it's
Mhm.
little
It's not
babies,
making it
little.
I like that, because then it's not like you're saying, "Hey, son, we're gonna sit down
Right.
and have
Dun,
this
dun, dun,
talk."
dun.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's like you're just
Mhm.
mixing it into a normal play activity.
Natural, organic flow from
Mhm.
birth to 5 to 10. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I like that, because I do feel like when we think about sex education, we put it in a box of like, we're going to sit down and
Right.
have a
No
sex
boxes.
education talk.
Nope. We're getting rid of the boxes. We're throwing them out. Nope.
Okay. So, like, I'm going to read you Brother Bear and it's not the stork, right? Like, it's like
Right.
two totally, yeah.
Yeah. Or My Body is Private, or Amazing You, or My Body is So Special. I mean, there's some amazing stuff out there that's so basic and so simple.
Yeah.
We're the
Okay.
ones, the adults, our anxiety and our nerves, rightfully so, I'm not judging, but
Right.
we are projecting all of that fear onto it, and we just have to shake out the nerves and go for it.
What
Easier said than
about,
done.
right? What about, like, I know like a lot of us we don't have to worry about this today because of COVID, but like soon enough, hopefully, when our kids are back in school and things like that. No, we're the parents that are really educating our children about sex and talking to them about intercourse and so on. And then they go to school and they're like, I'm going to tell my friends about this on the playground. Right. And then we get a call from the school or another
Yeah,
parent, because unfortunately they chose not to educate their children. So fine, so be it, but to each
right.
their own. But what are some ways to have that conversation with your kids about like these are conversations that are really not conversations to be having with your friends on the playground?
Yeah. And that is a great point as well. And I think we're also going to naturally, organically weave in to those conversations privacy versus secrets, because privacy versus secrets goes into sexual abuse prevention, proper body parts, the education piece that other people might not be sharing with their children. So what about a surprise birthday party? I'm just kind of pulling something out there. A surprise birthday party, that's a fun secret. That's a surprise. That is something that you can, after the fact, tell everybody. Kind of going into storytelling mode. Kids love stories. Give some, name some of their kids on the playground or some kids at school that they love. Weave storytelling into it and show them the difference between what we do at our house might not be what somebody else does at their house. You know, this isn't a secret. This is just our privacy, and being able to explain that to them age appropriately.
Okay. Yeah, I like that because I do feel like, especially, I mean, like my 10-year-old, right? Like that age group. I mean, I could totally see her being like, guys, I got some stuff to tell you about, right? Like they're at that age where my
Uh,
son probably be like, I'm not sharing this information with anybody.
right. And we don't want them to feel shame by that, because if somebody else hasn't shared with their children, I mean, we can always fall back into, well, that's what we do at our house. So we have open, transparent conversations.
Yeah.
That's not my issue. That's your issue.
Yeah, I know. Well, and it's hard. And then like, I always use the term I am your Google with my children. So
I
it's
love it.
like
Yes.
no matter what kind of question you have or how uncomfortable it feels to ask me, like I much prefer you come to me and I promise to give you my honesty and to
Yes.
answer it for you if you ask me, because I much rather them come to me than ask a friend on the playground, or worse, look it up on Google. Because
Yes,
like,
and I give
ah,
my kids those, yes, I give my kids those direct, um, incidences, because I was looking up one time, our cat was sick, and I was Googling something about the cat peeing outside the litter box, and literally types of pornography came up, and I was like, "Oh my god." And so I immediately went, they were elementary schoolers, I think they were 4th and 5th grade, and I was like, "Guys, your term. I'm your Google. Do you know what I just saw? Do you know what I just found? And I really don't want you seeing that, because," and I went into the whole brain development, and they're looking at me like, what? But I had them at the pornography and do you know what I just saw, and told them the story. And they're like, whoo, wow. And they still talk about that. They're like, we're so glad you told us that, because I certainly would have been Googling something. So I love that you said that. I'm your
yeah.
Google.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. Terms can bring up some super inappropriate stuff on the internet.
And
And
we cannot parental block it all. We just can't.
no, and here's the thing. So I'll tell you, my kids are going to kill me for this one. My oldest was like 9. I caught her on YouTube, and like, thank God it was YouTube because it's not like real pornography, but
Mhm.
I knew she was up to something because she was being sneaky with the iPad. And I was like, what's going on? So I looked at,
Secrets.
yeah. So
Mhm.
I looked at the history because she like put it down really quick when I walked in the room. And by the way, everybody, that's a huge red flag. So I looked up her history and then had a conversation with it. But I took the conversation. So I'm interested to hear what you think about this, because kids will get curious, right? So we're not in a day and
Absolutely.
age of like Playboy magazines anymore. We're in an age of
Natural.
online free pornography.
Yes. Natural
So
development to be curious.
yeah. So when they're curious and they look something up and you find out about it and you address it, how do you address that? Now, I'm going to tell you what I said first, because I don't know if this was right or wrong. But first of all, I overreacted. So I did get a little like upset almost, right? Like, what are you doing? And then I corrected that because I'm like, great, that's smart. Now she'll always be hiding things.
Mhm.
But then the second part was after we had a conversation about like me being the person she comes to with questions.
Mhm.
I also, because she has been exposed at this point, had a conversation to her about how, um, as an adult, sometimes sex is used as entertainment and that that's not real life sex. And then we talked a little bit about how a woman's body is beautiful, but all women's bodies are beautiful. And who you see on a magazine or in a pornography site is not how every woman looks. And you don't have to look that way to be beautiful. Because to me, with a daughter, now I don't think I would have had that conversation if it was a son, but for me, with a daughter, we already in society put so much pressure on ourselves to look perfect and be perfect. And at
Mhm.
that age, especially, right? Like the teenage years of like, I
Yes.
want to feel so pretty. And I didn't want my daughter comparing herself to these women that she had seen in these videos.
Mhm. And what you just said right there was exactly why we start having these conversations early and often, and why between 7 and 9 for a typically developing child, they need to know what puberty and intercourse is. So you can, that's the platform that you can jump off of when something like that happens.
Yeah. Well, because I had had the conversations early and often about puberty, but I did not have the conversations early about sex. So, like, again, like she was 9 when this happened. So
Mhm.
for me, I was like, she's not there yet with sex.
Mhm.
And then when my 10-year-old turned to 9, I thought the same thing. But then, like, she did something similar. And it was after we
Mhm.
found out her sister was pregnant. So
Right.
I said, like, do you have questions about your sister being pregnant? And she's like, not right now. I know how that happens. And I was like, okay, but you have to come to me anytime you have questions and like we'll talk this through. And
Mhm.
she is more reserved. So she didn't feel as comfortable coming to me. So then she tried to do research on her own. Right.
Yep.
So yes. So I can see in those two instances of my kids that are over the age of 8, why you're saying it's important to have like some kind of foundation of intercourse conversation prior to that, because um that made those conversations so much more like in depth and awkward because there was no foundation.
Exactly. So, I mean, we do the best we can, and when we figure it out, we know better, we do better. So,
Yeah. But do you
yeah.
agree with this like what like the approach, I guess, with if you catch your kid watching porn, what even like even if you've
That
had the sex education and you find out your
Mhm.
son is watching pornography. I had a mom reach out to me who
Mhm.
like straight out her son is definitely watching pornography and he
Mhm.
is much younger. So she was like, this is
Right.
shocking to me, and he's so young. And we talked it through a little bit, but and about having the conversations and not making them awkward, right? Was the talk I had with her.
So helpful.
But how
Yeah.
would you approach that as the parent in a situation like that?
Very similarly to how you did. You opened the door and you were just like, "Hey," um, and you explained it, but I don't think we talk a lot about pornography, and I really would like for us to be talking to our kids about pornography as part of that developmental piece. So before it actually happens, especially with all of the social media at our fingertips now,
Yeah.
and kids are natives. We are the immigrants and they
Yeah.
are the natives. And so they'll know it and keep up with it way faster than we will. So just having that conversation, I mean, storytelling, like, hey, I found it like with my work, it's a little bit easier because I just kind of blend stories together and say, oh my gosh, you'll never believe what happened today. I had this 3-year-old who came in, and this is not even a true story, but it's similar. I blended several stories together. I said, I had this 3-year-old come in today who was playing on their mom's phone and ended up on a zombie porn site. And so that prompted, they're like, what happened? Oh my gosh. And so then that opened the door to pornography and talking to them about curiosity, developmentally appropriate, bodies, feelings, desire, pleasure, and really getting into just an organic conversation. So,
Yeah. And I
mhm.
think, for parents listening out there that are really good about censoring your children's like what they watch on TV and like having good blockers on the internet and, no unsupervised internet, those things are all fine and dandy and great. And they're going to prevent them from figuring it out at home. But unless your kids never leave the home, let's say pre or after COVID life, like I'm not talking about currently, because right now it's kind of easy to keep them home, but when they return to
Right,
school, it doesn't matter how much you have protected your children from this environment. Like they're
right.
going to be exposed to it because a friend is going to tell them. I mean, that's the reason I caught my 17-year-old at 9 looking at stuff was because a friend's brother, when they were on a play date, was like, did you know that you can go on YouTube and you can look this up? And she was like, what? So she was curious and went home and looked it up. It
Mhm,
wasn't anything she
mhm.
found out about at home,
Yep, right.
you know?
And so having those what if conversations with your kids, like you would about what if somebody offers you drugs? What if somebody offers you alcohol? What if somebody wants you to look at porn? What if somebody wants you to touch them? What if somebody wants you to look at them? So having those what if games and scenarios early and often.
So do you
So
think that a lot of parents have a hard time having the conversations about like sexual assault and stuff because they feel like they're, I don't know, taking away a piece of a kid's innocence, so to speak?
I think that's part of it. We want to keep them young and sheltered from this big bad world for as long as we can. And really, the world is an amazing, beautiful place. And if we just give them the knowledge, knowledge is power. Knowledge is the power to protect our bodies. Knowledge is the power to understand our bodies. Knowledge is the power of prevention. I mean, I can't say enough how education and knowledge is not going to make somebody do something that you don't want them to do. It's going to give them the tools to be able to say, oh, no, I'm good. No, thanks. I'm good. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it does feel like, because it's such a, the act of sexual assault is such a horrible thing that we tend, like, to not want to have that conversation because we're like, well, that's not going to happen to my kid. Like, you know what I
well,
mean?
and people misunderstand and still to this day think that sexual assault is a violent somebody jumping out of the bushes or
No.
breaking into your house kind of thing, and it is
Yeah.
not.
No, I'll tell you, I can tell you. So, like, I've recently been going through this journey because I was sexually assaulted in middle school.
Mhm.
And I've recently been going through this journey of like a reflection of my teen years and how that sexual assault impacted me, as
Good.
well as like, so one thing that happened is I ended up having like sex with three men in their 30s when I was like 15 years old.
Mhm.
And it was willing sex because at that point, because the way I responded to sexual assault was to be very sexually active instead of like being afraid of men. I was like, I'm never going to let somebody take something from me that I don't want to give them. So instead, I'll just have sex with everybody and
Right.
like disassociate from sex. Right. So, that was the route that I went. But what's interesting about that is, with this reflection, not only I think recently it's impacted me because I'm in my 30s and I'm thinking about people that are the age I am today had sex with me at
Yeah.
15. And
And
that
that right
is
there
gross.
And that right there was not you consenting. That was people
Taking advantage of my age and yeah,
manipulating you and taking advantage of you. That
right.
is rape and sexual assault.
Right. And so like what's crazy about that to me is like, I mean, as a 36-year-old woman, it's like, no way would I ever consider being with somebody at 15 years old. And so the
Right.
fact that that happened, I now, at the time, I was like, ooh, I'm so special. I'm so mature for my age and I'm
Mhm.
so attractive that older men like me. That's
Yes.
what
And
I
Nicole, that
thought.
and that was their way of manipulating you to think you gave consent. You didn't give consent. They
Right.
made you think that. I'm so thankful that you're talking about this. I appreciate you sharing that.
And then like so now I'm like, so I had that epiphany this year where I was like, they were pedophiles. And like
Yes.
I didn't realize that, right? At the time. I didn't realize that until I hit the age they were when they had
Mhm.
sex with me.
Mhm.
And I'm not the only one. Like I'm
No.
definitely not the only one that's happened to. But it also made me reflect on like my whole childhood. And there was this one day that the fact that I remember this makes me know it wasn't okay. But
Mhm.
there was this one day when I was in elementary school that I went to a girlfriend's house to go swimming in her backyard. And her dad put sunblock on us. And he took down the bottom of the back of my bathing suit and rubbed sunblock all over my butt.
Yep.
And I felt so uncomfortable in that moment. There was nothing else that happened, right?
That's the test. That's the test they use to see what they can do. And so your icky meter went off. You were like, "Oh my god, that's your intuition. That's
Yeah.
you
Like
saying
he
that
put his
is
hand
that's
on the
not
back of
feel
my bathing suit,
good."
right?
Mhm,
And like what's like now I'm a mom. Like
mhm.
I have helped put sunblock on children, sure. But like I'm not their butt is covered by a bathing suit. It doesn't need
Exactly.
sunblock.
And
So
that's
like
part of the conversation we're encouraging parents to have when kids are little in
yeah.
the bathtub is,
Mhm.
you're naked now because you are taking a bath and mommy's helping you stay clean and healthy. But when you have a bathing suit on, your underwear on, those stay private and covered for a reason. And
Yeah.
do you feel like you can share that story? You could share that story with your children, or no?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so. But honestly, like I forgot about it until like this last like year of reflecting on sexual
Mhm.
assault in my
That's
life.
okay too. Yeah.
And then it like clicked. And I can tell you, I mean, I knew who I'm not going to say on my podcast
Right.
because I don't know the daughter these days. And you know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like what, I
Mhm.
don't know if anything ever came with other kids of that. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I know exactly who it was. I know exactly where I was standing. Like
Mhm.
that memory is so vivid. And I was probably in like second grade. And, I can't tell you a lot of memories from second grade. I really can't. Like, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? But the fact
Mhm.
that it's so distinct in my mind is
Right.
like, that wasn't okay. And I knew in that exact moment when I stood there, I remember feeling uncomfortable. Like you said, like an icky feeling. Like that was weird. Why'd he do that? But I
Mhm.
didn't say a word to him. I didn't say a word to my friend. I didn't go home and tell my parents. I just went about it, and I had been to their house 100 times after
Yep.
and before, and I easily
That
could have been sexually assaulted by this man,
mhm.
and, if I would have if I would have known if I would have known that somebody shouldn't have done that for sure, and it wasn't just me being paranoid, I would have gone home and told my parents.
Right, and that is why we don't shame kids for not telling, because they usually don't. It's usually 5 years later when a kid will tell, and some never tell. It's into their adult years. So it is
I
so
didn't.
natural and so normal to not
Yeah.
tell. They're
This
scared that
is
people aren't gonna believe them. They're scared that they're gonna get in trouble. They're gonna
Yep.
perpetrators make you think that you're consenting when you're not. So it's that whole brainwash. Some people call it grooming. I can't stand the word grooming. It is not grooming, it is manipulation. Grooming is a type of self-care, and perpetrating on a child or getting them to gain their trust is not grooming, it's manipulation. So
Yeah.
that word drives me nuts.
Right. And it can happen to anybody at any time. So this whole like
Absolutely.
it won't happen to my kid. We go to a great school. We live in a great community. I'll tell you what, like a month ago, the driver at the driver's ed school down the street from my house, my daughter went to driver's ed there and we canceled her in-car driving because of COVID. I was like, I'm uncomfortable with you being in the car with a stranger for 3 hours. Like, I'm sorry, be mad at me, but we're not doing it.
Right.
So a week after I canceled her, the guy that the driver ed teacher was arrested because he was touching the girls while they were doing the
Yep.
in-car driving with
Yep.
him.
And
It's everywhere. These
it
guys know
is. It
these I
doesn't
shouldn't say
discriminate.
guys, these people, because women are sexual predators as
It
well.
can
Like,
be.
yes,
It's a majority a male issue, but yeah,
yes.
there are
But
some women who do perpetrate. Yes.
so like I mean, they're everywhere. They're in our churches, they're in our
Yes.
school buildings, they're
Yep.
in the driver's ed, they're the Uber drivers, they're everywhere that our
Being
kids
aware.
are.
Yep, so
Yeah.
being aware, that's why the knowledge is so important, and what you just said, "I don't care if you're mad at me," for canceling your driver's ed, that right there is a great boundary. It's a healthy boundary. Your job as a parent, our job as parents is to keep them safe and healthy. We can't protect them and keep them in a bubble for everything, but we can sure darn give them the education and awareness. Might not protect them from everything, but that boundary was, "You can be mad at me all you want, but I'm going with what my instinct says and what I know to be good for us right now as a
Yeah.
family."
Do you think that when things like that happen in your community, you hear these stories about like somebody at the school was arrested or somebody, at the driver's ed or whatever. There was a parent that put a hidden camera in the girls' dressing room at a gymnastics studio by
Mhm.
us,
Yep.
right? And this was a father
Mhm.
of two teenage daughters
Yep.
at the school. These are our friends' parents,
Yes.
people, right? Like it's so many people you wouldn't expect.
Right.
And so when those things happen around you, are those good conversation starters to have with your children?
Absolutely, because it's storytelling, it's current events, it's non-judgmental, it's organic. Because like I tell mine, I don't want you to be paranoid and think you can't live life. I just want you to be aware. I want you to not be stuck in that phone walking down the street and either get hit by a bus or a perpetrator. So it's knowledge is power. So
Yeah.
absolutely, I think that's a great platform for an organic conversation, the
And
storytelling piece.
And I think you can make it so age appropriately, right? Like it's like so with the 7-year-old or my 10-year-old, it's like, oh my goodness, did you guys hear there was this man? He
Mhm.
teaches kids how to drive cars safely and he was taking advantage of that power and he was putting his hands on the girl and
Mhm.
she told him not to and he wouldn't stop. And so
Yep.
how do you feel about that? He got arrested because of that. Do you feel
It was a
like
touching problem. Yes.
right? And like you don't have to say like right, like, you don't have to if you don't feel I don't know, I feel like it depends on the age, but if they're really small and you're having that conversation versus my teenager where I'm like, "Dude, read this article. Like,
Right.
read this with
And
me.
that's
This
where
is"
my brain is stuck now is with the teen years because I have teenagers, but that full circle back to the mama bear effect has scripts exactly like what you were just describing
Yeah,
for a 5-year-old, for a 10-year-old, for a 12-year-old, for a 15-year-old. So,
yeah. I'm really excited to check out that website. That
it's
it
so
sounds like it's
comprehensive.
very, very
Oh, I love it.
resourceful.
Love it. Mhm.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting what you were saying about how like a lot of the times kids don't say because they're afraid that they'll be in trouble. Like
Mhm.
this is I mean, that's totally relatable to me. One, this is the first time ever I have said that the story about the dad touching my butt. First
Oh,
time ever because
an
I was
honor.
still like processing it. But
Mhm.
then with the sexual assault that happened to me, I didn't tell my parents about it
Mhm.
until I was like I live in another state. I'm an adult. Like
Yep.
no one ever knew. And they don't know details. They just know I was sexually assaulted. They don't know what
Mhm.
happened. They don't know the scenario, like none of that. In fact, I've been in therapy for years. And I last week told my therapist that I want to start talking about sexual assault. And she was like, I was waiting for you to bring that up. And I was like, I don't know. I've always thought I was past it. But recently, like I said, because of my age, and
Age is a developmental trigger. Yes, you just
yeah,
nailed it.
and I have 3 kids and I have a grandson. Like, I
Yep,
think that, like, all those factor into, like, "Whoa, wait a minute. These
yep.
things were b like, can I find out who these men were now? Like, I would like to call the police. Like, I don't know what to do." Like, there's so many thoughts and, like, it's crazy.
Yes, and thank you so much for having that courage to say all of this, because that brings us full circle back to sexual health and consent and respect. In the state of North Carolina, I don't know how it is for you, but I know you're East Coast with me. There is not a statute of limitations. So you can tell your story, but I'm all about respecting people's boundaries and sexual health. So we don't push little kids or adults to report. We will give them all the information to do so, but then it's up to them or their
Yeah,
parents to follow through with that, because we don't
right,
want to push something on them. They've already had their power stripped from them, no choice. Why are we going to continue to have that type of perpetrator
right,
bullying mentality?
right.
Give them everything they need and let them make the choice that's good for them, because they might not now, but when they're 36, they might.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
your choice.
And I think that that it's important to know, like, to anybody who has been sexually assaulted who didn't report and
Mhm.
could have, like, we're not saying that you were wrong to
No,
do that. Like,
absolutely.
it's such a personal journey and choice. And like, obviously, by all means, they deserve to go to jail and be arrested. Like, they deserve that. But if you're not ready to share that, then you don't, that's okay.
Correct. And if you're never ready to go with that, that's fine too, because you can have your own closure with your therapist. You can have your own closure with your own
Yeah,
journey. Yeah.
self-love and
Yep.
therapy. Like,
Mhm.
please do that though. Don't just sit in it.
Don't
Don't.
suffer in silence.
No.
Have a special person. Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so the reason for me I didn't tell at the time with sexual assault was because of what you're saying. Like, I felt, and it wasn't like regular the way you look at rape. It was like I was put in a room with a guy that was a friend's friend, and I was told I wasn't allowed to leave that room until I let him have sex with me
Yep.
by the other people on the outside of the door.
Yep.
And so I was like, what? Okay. And then I just let him because
Mhm.
I had to if I wanted to leave that room. And it was like a weird situation. It felt disgusting. It was like
Yep.
horrible. And that's what it was for me. But I felt like I allowed that to happen. So I couldn't tell my parents because then they'd be like, like they would look at it as I was having sex, not, like
Right.
that's how I thought of it because I was so young, right? I was like,
And that's why I'm so glad you're in therapy, because a good therapist who is trauma informed is going to point that out to you and say, "Oh, whoa, did you hear what that was?" That's what we call cognitive distortion, where the perpetrator makes you think that it was your fault, but it's
yeah,
really theirs, and helps you unpack all of that and put it into place and free you of any distortion that it was your fault or
right.
you caused it or you consented, because absolutely not.
Right. Well, and I
Mhm.
know that. Like, I
Yeah,
know that
love
now
that
that
for
in
you.
any sexual
Mhm.
assault situation, it is never your fault,
Right.
ever. I don't care if you were making out with a guy for 10 hours at a bar, took him home, and then he raped you. He raped you. Like,
Yeah.
that's,
No means
like,
no.
it doesn't
Mhm.
matter. It doesn't matter. It's never
Mhm.
your fault.
Right.
But, and I know that. But, like, at the time in my
Exactly.
adolescent brain,
Brain.
I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna get in trouble. I did something really bad." So I just like sat in it for
Mhm.
most of the rest, like half my childhood into my adult life, like, you know. And so that being said, I do want to ask you, what about the opposite in situations where your child has been sexually assaulted, but they're very, very young. So let's say baby to like 3 years old, okay? And,
Mhm.
like, like, short-term memory is still not a big thing. What is
Mhm.
your take on that? If it's mentioned or you find out about it and they don't really seem to have, like, a vivid memory of it, Do you move on from that, or do you have those conversations with your kids?
And have those conversations with your kids when? Af Years
When, yeah,
later or
years later, or like, so like I know someone, this is why I'm asking that. I know somebody who had that happen where their child, I don't remember, but I want to say it was 2, and there was a sexual assault from a daycare or
Mhm,
preschool,
mhm,
something like that.
mhm.
And they knew about it. They got their kid help, but the people that were helping her told her to, unless the kid brings it up again, don't bring it up again, because your child might not remember this happening.
Hmm.
And I always was like, I don't know, because like the more we grow and the more I talk to like life coaches and therapists and
Yeah.
doctors, the more I hear more and more about these inner child things that have happened to us in life that maybe we don't even remember happening, but they still impact us.
Right. So we may not have physical picture memory, but we have somatic memory or feeling memory.
Yeah.
So, right. So I think if you are building a foundation of open, honest, early and often communication that is building confidence and self-esteem, that is part of your child's story. It's the fabric of who you guys are as a family. So you're not necessarily going to sit down like with all the other things we've talked about and it be a one and done. Do you remember? No, it's going to be more of part of the story. You know how when you're looking at the picture or the family album of, look when I was pregnant with you, or look when we went on this trip to the beach, or whatever. It's
Yeah.
part of their story. So, I mean, I see the point about not bringing it up just to be bringing it up, but there may be a time in their teen years or their young adult years that it organically presents itself that you can unpack it and talk about it and offer them, hey, do you feel like this developmentally is impacting you? Do you want to go talk to somebody? There's no shame in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That rambled. Did that make sense? I
Yeah,
just
no, that makes sense.
Mhm,
I was
mhm.
interested because we're talking so much about like why children don't speak up, but what if the children aren't even at a speaking age? Do you bring it up later? Right? It's like that's
Right.
because
I
it
mean,
does happen, unfortunately. I
it
mean,
does. And I'm thinking of my time as a forensic interviewer. And when I was the forensic interviewer, I couldn't be the therapist. But if I was the therapist, I have kids now that are coming back to me. I had them um, back when they were, gosh, 3, 4, and 5, and now they're 17 and 18, and they're coming back. And I don't have motivation in school. I don't know. I'm like, well, do you remember us talking about them? Well, no, my parents told me, and so they don't remember it, but we use it as a platform to make connections and not blame. Oh, well, this is happening because of this, but they have that feelings memory, and so we really unpack a lot of that as part of their story, who they
yeah,
are, their identity development.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's interesting. The more I feel like the more people I talk to, the more I learn about there's these pieces of us that we don't recall at all, but they still have an impact on us that we have to like dig into.
The body remembers. The body remembers. Yep.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about this, like why it's so important. I mean, I feel like everything we're saying is why it's so important, but I know that you do a lot of work around protecting sexual reproduction system.
Mhm, mhm.
And I'd like to know how that ties to the sex education.
Absolutely. So we've built all of these bridges. We're talking about confidence, self-esteem, open, transparent conversation, and that leads us into our sexual reproductive health. So I really don't feel like we're doing a great job in the schools as parents and society of letting kids know, hey, sexually transmitted infections can ruin your possibility of a healthy natural pregnancy. Hey, smoking, vaping, these types of drugs can wreck your sperm. um, I feel like fertility health and reproductive health and sex ed go hand in hand. And we're spending a lot of time, and I say this, no judgment, just observation. We spend a lot of time teaching kids how not to get pregnant, and we leave a lot of stuff out.
Mm, I agree. So that being said, with the reproductive health and we teaching our kids not to get pregnant because that, I
Mhm.
mean, I think the schools especially really only touch on like safe sex, right? Like use a condom, use birth
Mhm.
control, and
Mhm.
then they talk about the reproductive system,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
then it stops there. And it's funny because like, most of my listeners know this about me. So like I was a teen mom.
Okay.
And then when my daughter hit her teens, I asked the school because it was a big passion of mine to educate. And so I wanted to do like a work with groups of kids at the school and discuss what life really looks like for a young mom
Mhm.
and what happens when you do get pregnant, not
Mhm.
the don't get pregnant. And because I feel like that's missing too, like that
Yeah.
piece of education is
Mhm.
missing.
Yep.
And I know that we have like child development classes where they carry
Mhm.
around the robot baby for like a couple
Mhm.
days or whatever, but like it's just come on, it's not the same.
Right.
It's not the same.
I
And
know,
the
and most kids I know at our school, they have to opt into that class. They have to
yeah,
choose
ours
that
too.
elective,
Yeah, it's an
so they're
elective.
not right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's an elective where I in Maryland as well. So,
mm,
I mean, home ec isn't even like classes that we take anymore, right? Like we've really
right.
like let's stop teaching people how to live life after high school and
Mhm.
just teach them
Right.
algebra. And it's like, gee, come on, people. But
Yes,
that's a whole nother
but that's a whole
conversation.
but
But
I'm so on board with you with that. The physical, emotional, sexual, spiritual, financial parts of self. I mean, finances,
yeah,
sexual
that should be
health,
your math
you know.
credit. Finances should be your math credit. Like sex
Amen. Mhm.
education should be a mandatory class, like,
Mhm.
which should be tied
Yeah.
in with child development, which, like all of that.
Yeah.
But they would not let me do groups at the school. They said, like, no, we can't do that. Like, we can't talk about this
Mhm.
stuff at school. Like, it has to be this. And I was like, ugh, like it was
Yeah.
like, okay,
Yeah.
fine. They just
On
really
the
want to shut the door
curriculum.
on this stuff. It's being such a great segue for us into the world of not, just the sex education for teenagers and
Yeah.
not getting pregnant versus when they're pregnant and teens and sex. I really want to dive in deep to this, and I don't want the episode to be so long. So let's make this two parts. So
Okay.
we're gonna wrap up on our child education with sex and um, all of this exciting stuff with the sexual reproductive
Yeah.
system, and break
Mhm.
into a part two. So
Okay.
stay tuned for next week. You will hear part two all about teens and sex.